On the evening of February 20th, 2013, 49-year-old coach Jimmy McLean blew his whistle and brought basketball practice to an end inside of a high school gym in Memphis, Tennessee. His young players rushed to the sidelines and gathered up around Jimmy. And even amongst a group of basketball players, Jimmy looked big. He was 6'4", but his long arms and legs made him seem even taller. And even though he was almost 50 years old, he still completely looked like he could get out on that court and play. Jimmy told the kids they had a great practice, and he told them what he wanted them to focus on over the next few days. Jimmy and the other coaches had led the team to a great season, but they all had their eyes on a state championship, and Jimmy knew how much hard work and focus it would take to get there. Jimmy had been an incredible high school basketball player in his own right back in Arkansas where he grew up. He'd gone on to play at the University of Central Arkansas alongside Chicago Bulls legend Scottie Pippen, and after college, Jimmy actually played ball in a professional minor league for years. And so now, the young men on his team looked up to Jimmy because of his illustrious basketball career, but also they admired him because he was one of their teachers and mentors, and they knew he cared about them as people first and as players second. Jimmy just wanted them to do their best and take care of each other, win or lose. Jimmy told the team to go hit the showers and then go home and hit the books. He had a quick talk with the other coaches and then headed out to his car in the school parking lot. The drive home took Jimmy about 30 minutes away to Cordova, a suburb that was made up of secluded neighborhoods filled with huge homes that had perfectly manicured lawns. Jimmy had lived here in Cordova for about 15 years, but there were still times it felt like a different world from the small Arkansas town he'd grown up in. But as he got older, Jimmy had really come to embrace Cordova as his home, and he knew living there had allowed him to pursue his passions. Jimmy loved basketball, but sports was not all that he cared about. He was also a very talented writer, and he was a devout Christian who felt a calling to serve God and his community. And so during his time in Cordova, Jimmy had written his first book and become a pastor at a local church, two dreams he'd had since he was a kid. A little after 8:30 p.m., Jimmy pulled onto a street which looked like most of the other streets in town. He drove past the driveway of his large 4-bedroom house, parked by the curb, and then hit the button on his garage door opener. Jimmy took a deep breath and watched as the garage door opened. In public places like church or school, Jimmy was outgoing, energetic, and confident. But there was a different side to Jimmy, a side that only the people closest to him ever saw. In private, Jimmy often got really anxious, and some people even said obsessive, about the littlest of things. Once the garage door was all the way open, Jimmy swung his car around and backed down the driveway all the way into the garage, with his car facing out onto the street. Then once he was parked inside, he pushed the garage door button again, and he sat in his car watching the garage door close. This order of how he would go about parking his car was something he did every single time he came home, and he never changed the routine. He would always sit there in the car watching the door until it came all the way closed. Once the door was closed, Jimmy grabbed his leather bag out of the passenger seat, got out of his car, unlocked the door that led from the garage into the house, and he walked inside. Once he was inside, he locked the door he had just come through and went right to the front room of the house. There, he carefully laid his bag down on a leather couch and then very carefully placed his keys on top of the bag, just like he did every single night when he got home from practice. After all that, Jimmy walked over to the leather couch that matched the chair that he had just put his bag and keys on, and he took off his sport coat, folded it along the sleeves, and laid it over the arm of this couch. And then once that ritual was complete, he went towards the front door, leaned down, and then slid a small rug that was in the entryway up against the bottom of the door. He would say he did this to keep the draft out. Jimmy never missed any of these steps when he got home, and he would go through them again in reverse order when leaving for work in the morning. People who loved Jimmy usually just got used to his particular habits, but they also knew Jimmy had a lot of trouble adjusting to how other people did things. And also, Jimmy really did not like to be confronted about his routines. Jimmy's phone buzzed inside of his pocket, and he smiled. Right on time, he thought. He grabbed his phone, and he read a text message from his girlfriend, Carlotta Smith. Her message said, "How was practice?" And Jimmy replied, "Great!" Carlotta lived almost 3 hours away in Nashville, Tennessee, so Jimmy only saw her maybe a few times a month. But they made sure to text or call each other every morning and every night. And Carlotta always seemed to know exactly when Jimmy got home from school. Now, the long-distance aspect of their relationship could get frustrating, but Jimmy couldn't remember the last time he was this happy. Jimmy was technically still married, but he and his wife had separated 4 years earlier, and they had finally started divorce proceedings. But Jimmy had been slow to get into another serious relationship, part of him still felt loyal to his soon-to-be ex-wife and her 2 kids, who he was a stepfather to. But when Jimmy had met Carlotta 6 months earlier, he knew almost right away that he was falling in love all over again. Jimmy slipped his phone back into his pocket, and he walked through the room past the fireplace and towards the kitchen, but he suddenly stopped. He thought he heard something. Jimmy stood there for a second, and then he heard the sound again. It was coming from somewhere out front of the house. He turned around and walked towards one of the windows that overlooked the front yard, but there was nothing out there, and it was totally silent. And so Jimmy figured, he was just being anxious, like there's nothing going on here. So he left the window and headed back towards the kitchen, but then he heard another sound right behind him, and this time he knew something was right outside his front door. At 8:40 p.m. that night, so just a few minutes after Jimmy had gotten home, his next-door neighbor was home and having a bite to eat at the dining room table when he suddenly heard popping sounds. Now, the sounds were loud enough that the neighbor immediately stopped eating, got up, went to the window to look outside, but they didn't see anything, and they didn't hear anything. Now, the neighbor knew the sounds he had heard could have been gunfire, but it also could have just been some kids setting off firecrackers, like he really didn't know. But just in case, he grabbed his phone off the table, and he called the non-emergency number for the Shelby County Sheriff's Department. And when they picked up, he explained to the operator that he just heard these loud sounds right nearby that he thought maybe could be gunfire. The operator told him to stay in his house and that an officer would be over right away. And sure enough, a few minutes later, a Shelby County deputy knocked on the neighbor's door, and Jimmy's neighbor told him what he had told the operator. The deputy thanked him and said he'd take a look around and see if he could find anything, and then he left the neighbor's house and headed back towards his cruiser. The deputy drove around the small neighborhood several times and did what he thought was a thorough patrol of the area. But he didn't find anything suspicious, so finally he went back to Jimmy's neighbor and told him, everything seemed fine. Then the deputy left and drove back to the station, and Jimmy's neighbor tried to calm his nerves and not worry too much about the strange sounds. Two days later, on the morning of February 22nd, 2013, one of Jimmy's fellow basketball coaches sat in the high school's front office across from a school administrator, and both men looked very worried. Jimmy had not shown up to teach his classes or to coach basketball practice the previous day, which was completely out of the ordinary. Jimmy almost never missed school or practice. He would rather show up sick than feel like he was letting the kids down. And he definitely wouldn't stay home without calling to let somebody know he was not going to come in. Now, the day before, when Jimmy hadn't shown up, both of these men had told themselves that, maybe there had been some sort of miscommunication, that, perhaps Jimmy had let somebody in the office know he wasn't coming in, but that didn't get relayed. But now, Jimmy was gone for a second day in a row, and nobody at the school had any record of him calling. And now the coach and the administrator really regretted not doing something 24 hours earlier. So the administrator dialed the Shelby County Sheriff's Department, and he said his colleague, Jimmy McLean, had not come into work for 2 straight days, and that was really strange, and he wondered if maybe police could go by Jimmy's house to make sure he was okay. The operator got Jimmy's address and told the administrator that an officer would go to Jimmy's property to do a wellness check right away. A little bit later that morning, at about 10 a.m., 2 Shelby County deputies arrived at Jimmy's house. They went up to the front door and they knocked, but they got no response. And after a little while of just total silence, one of the deputies tried the doorknob, but the door was locked. So he called his boss and got permission to try to force his way into Jimmy's house. The deputy used a simple lockpicking tool to quickly get the door open, and then once it was, he and his colleague stepped inside, and immediately they called their boss back. A few minutes later, Lieutenant Jason Valentine of the Shelby County Sheriff's Department parked in front of Jimmy's house and approached the 2 deputies, who were now standing just outside of the open front door. Lieutenant Valentine put on his gloves and greeted the 2 deputies, and then they stepped aside to let him pass. Once inside, Valentine made his way to the front room of the house, and right away he noticed a large dried blood stain on the other side of the room in front of the fireplace. And just beyond the blood, Valentine saw the dead body of a middle-aged man. Valentine walked over to the body and saw that the man's face, neck, and shirt were also stained with large amounts of dried blood, and the man's limbs looked very stiff, like rigor mortis had set in. And so this, coupled with all the dried blood, made Valentine think that the man had been dead for a while. Valentine began to scan the room. He saw in a nearby leather chair there was a bag with keys sitting on top of it, and then on the couch there was a sports coat laying over the arm. Valentine went to the coat, reached into the inside pocket, and he found a wallet with a driver's license inside of it. And the man in the photo matched the man on the floor. It was Jimmy McLean, and from the looks of it, Jimmy had been murdered. And so at this point, Lieutenant Valentine asked the two deputies outside to come into the house and help him do an initial search. And right away, they noticed there was a whole bunch of high-end electronics that were left untouched all throughout the house. And so this seemed to indicate to the officers that, it didn't seem likely that the person who killed Jimmy had come here to rob him. It seemed like they had come here to kill him. After searching the 4 bedrooms, which all seemed undisturbed, Valentine walked down a long hallway to the door that led to the garage. He entered the garage, and he saw Jimmy's car was parked right there inside, facing the closed garage door. But other than that, there really wasn't much to see in the garage. There were no obvious prints, no sign of blood, no forced entry. So Valentine went back inside the house to keep looking. And a few minutes later, Valentine's fellow county detective, Alan Bean, stepped inside the home, and he was followed by several state forensics officers. Valentine and Bean worked together often, and so Valentine knew Bean had a sharp eye for evidence. And so Valentine right away told him that the front door and the door leading in from the garage had both been locked when police first arrived. And so Bean turned and went right to the front door, and he found that the door itself could be locked from the inside, but if someone had left through that door, they could only lock that door by using a key. Then Bean looked at the entryway of the house, and he saw there was a rug laying nearby, but it was at a strange angle, like somebody had pushed it away from the door. Then something between the rug and the door caught his eye. He crouched down and he signaled for Lieutenant Valentine to come look too. At first, Valentine thought what he was looking at was just some mud on the floor, but Bean pointed at one particular spot within the mud, and what it was a small portion of a shoe print. Now, there wasn't nearly enough of a print to tell what kind of shoe or what size it was, but Bean hoped the forensics team would be able to use this partial shoe print to tell them more at some point. Now, Bean and Valentine both knew that this print could just be the victim's, but there were no other prints anywhere like it on the floor, so it seemed like there was a real chance it belonged to the killer. As forensics officers began to pull the shoe print, Valentine led Bean over to the body. Multiple .40 caliber bullet casings lay on the floor near the dried pool of blood around Jimmy, and so it seemed clear Jimmy had been shot several times. And so Valentine and Bean came up with the same initial theory. Whoever killed Jimmy likely knew him really well. The level of violence inflicted on Jimmy looked like the result of rage that often accompanies a crime of passion. And assuming the killer was indeed close with Jimmy, they very likely had their own house key that they could have used to lock the door on their way out. The forensics team continued their work in the house, and the detectives canvassed the neighborhood to see if someone had seen or heard anything strange. And they found the information they were looking for at the very first house they tried. Jimmy's next-door neighbor told them that he had called the sheriff's department 2 nights earlier when he heard a series of loud popping sounds that maybe could have been gunfire or fireworks, he wasn't sure. Valentine asked if he knew what time that took place, and the man grabbed his phone, scrolled through his recent calls, and saw he had called the sheriff's department at 8:40 p.m. Now, even though Valentine and Bean did not have an official autopsy report from the medical examiner, at this point, they both felt confident that this neighbor had actually heard the sound of Jimmy's murder, and that Jimmy had very likely been laying dead in his house for 2 days. The detectives thanked the neighbor and then left and headed back over to Jimmy's house. There, a forensics officer waved them down and handed over Jimmy's phone that had been found inside of his pocket and bagged as evidence. And then a little bit later that day, when Valentine and Bean were back at the station, they did a full data search of Jimmy's phone. And as they combed through Jimmy's text messages and calls, they knew exactly who they wanted to speak to first. The woman who had texted Jimmy right before he died, Carlotta Smith. The day after Jimmy's body was found, Detective Valentine walked Carlotta into an interview room at the sheriff's department. Valentine told her how sorry he was for her loss and how much he appreciated her coming in. Valentine wanted Carlotta to feel very at ease, as if she was just there to help. But in reality, she was already at the top of the investigator's suspect list. By this point, the medical examiner had officially confirmed Valentine and Bean's initial theory that Jimmy had died on the night that neighbor had called police, most likely not long after responding to Carlotta's text. Valentine and Bean had also contacted members of Jimmy's family, and they had learned that Carlotta and Jimmy had been in a serious relationship for about 6 months. And as Jimmy's serious girlfriend, she very likely had a key to his house, and she would also fit the profile of someone who would maybe commit a crime of passion. On top of that, a victim's intimate partners are almost always primary suspects at the beginning of any murder investigation. After Carlotta sat down at the table across from the two detectives, Valentine asked her about the final text message she had sent to Jimmy. Carlotta explained that she tried to text Jimmy every night when she knew he'd be getting home from basketball practice. It was one of the ways they stayed connected while living 3 hours apart. After that, Valentine asked Carlotta if she had her own key to Jimmy's house that she used whenever she came into town, but Carlotta shook her head and said no, she didn't. Valentine seemed very surprised. He said he thought that she and Jimmy were pretty serious and always stayed together when they visited each other. And Carlotta said they were serious, but she actually didn't stay at his house when they visited. She was a religious person, and she just didn't feel right spending the night at the house of a married man. So she had told Jimmy that until his divorce went through, she would stay by herself at a hotel whenever she came to town. Valentine hesitated for a second. He thought Carlotta actually sounded angry, and so he asked her if it bothered her that Jimmy was still married. And when he said this, Carlotta immediately seemed like she might just start crying. She said it absolutely bothered her, and she thought Jimmy was actually kind of dragging his feet with the divorce, and she was kind of tired of it. Valentine knew it was best to just let her keep talking, so he just kept nodding along like he understood exactly what she was going through. And so Carlotta just kept on talking. She went on a rant about Jimmy's wife and how he was still way too friendly with her and how it didn't make sense that this woman was still part of Jimmy's life. Finally, Carlotta trailed off, at which point Valentine asked her for a few more details about where she had been when Jimmy was killed. Carlotta said she had been at home in Nashville, but then she said police really needed to speak to Jimmy's wife. The wife and her son lived close to Jimmy, and the wife just could not seem to let Jimmy go. And Carlotta was sure Jimmy's wife still had a key. Valentine thanked Carlotta for coming in and told her she could leave. And then after she was gone, the detectives couldn't help but feel like Carlotta had not really helped her own cause here. If she was as angry about Jimmy's marriage as she seemed, then perhaps that was her motive to kill Jimmy. The following day, Valentine and Bean brought Jimmy's wife, Carla McLean, and her 19-year-old son, Dwayne Moore, into the station. Valentine and Bean questioned Carla first, and she seemed totally distraught about her husband's death. She said he was such a good man who loved God and loved helping young people. It just didn't make sense that he was gone. But Bean asked the obvious question. Was there any animosity between her and Jimmy during their 4-year separation and now during their initial divorce proceedings? But Carla just shook her head. She said that she and Jimmy were good friends, they just didn't quite work as a romantic couple. So Bean asked Carla if she still had a key to Jimmy's house, since after all, they were on good terms. Carla got a look on her face like she was searching for something, and then she said she didn't think she had a key, and if she did, she had forgotten where it was. Bean and Valentine nodded like that made complete sense, but inside, they did not buy that at all. And they believed Carla was lying right to their faces. Valentine asked Carla where she was on the night Jimmy was killed, and Carla said she'd been home the whole night with her son Dwayne, and he would vouch for her. Valentine nodded and then asked if police could actually have her phone to download her data, because this would be an easy way to confirm where she was and to cross her off their list. Carla immediately reached into her purse, pulled out her phone, and put it on the table. She said police could search it all they wanted, she had absolutely nothing to hide. Bean picked up the phone and left the room, and then Carla was escorted out, and then her son, Dwayne, was brought in. Dwayne was quiet and respectful, but at first all he cared about was whether or not his mom was okay. And Valentine said his mom was just fine and she'd be waiting for them as soon as they were done. And so the detectives and Dwayne talked for a short time, and the kid seemed a bit nervous, but he was cooperative. He said he liked and respected Jimmy. They bumped heads sometimes like any stepfather and stepson would, but he thought, Jimmy was overall a good man, and he had no idea who would want to hurt him. Dwayne said he did not have a key to Jimmy's house, and that on the night Jimmy was killed, he was at home with his mom. Valentine thanked Dwayne for coming in, and then led him to an office where his mother was waiting. A little bit later, Bean informed Valentine that all the data on Carla's phone had been gathered up, and so the detectives gave Carla her phone back and told her and Dwayne they were free to go. It would take a while for Bean and other investigators to go through all of Carla's text messages and phone calls, and so while he waited, Valentine got back in touch with a few of Jimmy's family members, and they all said the same thing about Jimmy's wife, Carla. Her relationship with Jimmy was not nearly as good as she wanted people to believe, In fact, she and Jimmy had been fighting recently because Carla wanted him to sell his house and give her half of the profit as part of their divorce. After talking to Jimmy's family, Valentine delved a bit deeper into Carla and Jimmy's financial records, and he found a huge red flag. Carla was the beneficiary of Jimmy's life insurance policy. And so between that policy and the potential sale of the house, Carla stood to make hundreds of thousands of dollars now that Jimmy was dead. So at this point, the detectives had two women, Jimmy's girlfriend and his wife, who were very strong suspects. Jimmy's girlfriend could have murdered him out of anger or jealousy about his marriage, and his wife could have killed him for the money. Over the next couple of days, investigators revisited the crime scene and conducted more interviews, trying to find anything that would directly connect Jimmy's girlfriend or wife to the murder. Then Detective Bean got a call from a forensics officer, and this officer sounded like he had just hit the jackpot. He told Bean they were able to create a reconstruction of the sole of the shoe that left that muddy footprint inside of Jimmy's house. And this shoe was a size 10.5 men's shoe, which was not the size shoe that Jimmy wore. Then the officer said that the forensics team had actually worked directly with Nike, and they were able to determine that the shoe was a Nike Air Force One high top, a favorite among young basketball players. Bean hung up and rushed over to tell Valentine the news, and they both felt exhilarated by it, but also totally confused. This was a huge piece of evidence, but it undercut the theory that one of the two women in Jimmy's life had killed him. Neither Carlotta nor Carla wore that size shoe. And so the detectives thought that this piece of evidence seemed to point to maybe somebody on the high school basketball team that Jimmy coached. Not long after learning about this shoe, Bean and Valentine headed to Memphis, Tennessee to interview students and faculty at the school where Jimmy taught and coached. And right away, things took a bizarre turn. A coach told the detectives that one of the team's star basketball players had recently been exposed as a 22-year-old man who was pretending to be a high schooler so he could dominate the sport and hopefully earn a college scholarship. The school had discovered the player's secret and promptly kicked him off the team after an anonymous call was made to the school district about this kid. Now, the coach said everybody knew Jimmy prided himself on being honest and that he despised the idea of cheating. And so a lot of people at the school thought Jimmy might have been the anonymous caller who sold out the 22-year-old. At this point, Valentine and Bean understood what the coach was getting at. If this 22-year-old player found out that, Jimmy was the guy who called on him, well, maybe he was the one who killed Jimmy for ruining his chances to play in college and maybe make it to the NBA. And to make things even more suspicious, the coach said the disgraced 22-year-old player had recently moved out of the city. The detectives thanked the coach and then tracked down the player's records in the school's front office. Valentine found a local phone number for the player's mother, so he reached out to the woman and asked her to come to the station. The following day, Valentine and Bean sat in the interview room, staring at a woman who either looked extremely young for her age or who had lied to them on the phone about who she was. So before Valentine launched into any questions about the investigation, he asked the woman flat out if she really was this player's mother. The woman just laughed and said no, she was his wife, and then she admitted that she had helped him forge his transcript and listed herself as his mother. This would allow him to go back and pretend to be a high schooler. Valentine and Bean looked at each other and just shook their heads. This all seemed absolutely absurd. Bean asked the woman if her husband had any issues with his coach, Jimmy McLean, or if he believed Jimmy was the one who called the school anonymously and exposed his scam. The woman kept on smiling. She said she didn't know if her husband had a problem with Jimmy, but Jimmy definitely did not call the district, because she did. Because she had caught her husband cheating on her with a high school girl, and she wanted to ruin him. Valentine looked over at Bean again, and then he just sat back in his chair and stared at this woman. This now seemed like something out of a soap opera. But still, even after this woman left, the detectives agreed that the fake high school basketball player was someone who might wear Nike Air Force One shoes. He also could have had problems with Jimmy about something else, and also his story was so strange and calculated and full of lies that Valentine and Bean did not want to rule him out, at least not yet. But just as they started looking deeper into this whole weird scenario with this fraudulent basketball player, something happened 300 miles away that would change the entire investigation. On the night of February 26, 2013, 6 days after Jimmy's murder, a woman in pajamas burst into a police station in Crossville, Tennessee, over 4.5 hours from Cordova, where Jimmy was killed. The woman screamed that she was in danger and she needed protection. Several officers got up from their chairs and ran over to her and ushered her into a small office. The police tried to calm her down, but she was frantic, and she kept looking all around her like somebody was following her. The officers told her they could help, but they needed to know what was going on. Finally, the woman took several breaths and calmed down, and then she said somebody had just told her husband who had murdered Jimmy McClain over in Cordova, and now she was worried that somebody would come after them because of what they knew. It took a while for the officers to get all the necessary information from this woman, but when they felt like they had a grasp on the situation, one of the officers rushed to his desk and called the Shelby County Sheriff's Department. Lieutenant Valentine picked up and he listened to the whole crazy story about this woman in pajamas. And information from that call led Valentine and Bean to do another search of Jimmy's wife's phone records. And during that search, they found what they were looking for. On the day of the murder, Jimmy's wife Carla had been texting with a young man in town who was a known drug dealer, a guy who everybody called Pooh. And Pooh definitely had the connections and the skills to have somebody killed. On March 5th, 2013, about 2 weeks after Jimmy's murder, 2 undercover cops sat in an unmarked car not far from Pooh's house. They were conducting surveillance on the house and waiting for Pooh to do something they could bring him in for. And they didn't have to wait long. The officers watched Pooh step out of his house, and he was clearly carrying a gun. And so the officers got out of their car and called out to Pooh, saying they needed to speak to him. But Pooh didn't waste any time. He ditched his gun into the yard and then took off running towards the back of his house. The 2 cops followed on foot, but Pooh sprinted through the alley, he ran between a couple of houses, and then he turned onto a residential street. Pooh looked over his shoulder, and the cops were nowhere to be seen, so he slowed down a bit and kept heading towards the end of the road. Suddenly, tires screeched on the road, and Pooh saw a SWAT vehicle come to a stop right in front of him. Pooh turned and tried to run again, but 2 members of the SWAT team leapt out of the vehicle, and they were fast. They caught up to Pooh and tackled him to the ground, and Pooh relented and did not put up a fight. The SWAT team would search him, and they would find baggies full of pills and also marijuana. And then a few minutes later, the undercover cops who had been conducting the surveillance, they arrived, and they had retrieved the gun that Pooh had thrown into the yard. And so now the police had enough evidence to hold Pooh on drug and weapons charges. A little bit later that day, Pooh sat inside of an interview room across from Detectives Valentine and Bean and several other investigators at the Shelby County Sheriff's Department. Valentine stared across the table at Pooh and then glanced down at Pooh's phone that police had confiscated. Valentine held up the phone, leaned across the table, and showed Pooh a photo. Pooh looked at the photo and then lowered his eyes. The picture was of a handgun and piles of cash sitting on a blanket. Then Valentine pointed out several text messages that Pooh had sent and received from Jimmy's wife, Carla, leading up to the time of Jimmy's murder. Valentine said it did not take a huge leap to think maybe Pooh had been hired to kill Jimmy. Pooh was silent for a minute, then he raised his head and looked at Valentine and the other investigators, and he said he would tell them everything. Based on information provided by Pooh, cell phone data, evidence at the scene, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Jimmy McClain on the night of February 20th, 2013. On that night, the killer slouched down in the driver's seat of their car that was parked just a few houses away from Jimmy's. In their hand, they clutched a Smith & Wesson Sigma, a .40 caliber pistol. A little after 8:30 p.m., the killer saw Jimmy's car pull up in front of his house and then reverse into his garage. The killer watched the garage door close all the way, hiding Jimmy inside the house, and at that point, the killer got out of their car, they crouched low to the ground, and ran across Jimmy's front yard, not noticing they had just gotten mud on the underside of one of their shoes. A moment later, the killer reached into their pocket and pulled out a single key on a key ring. They took a breath, clutched the gun tighter in their hand, and then crept out of the bushes. Staying low, they approached Jimmy's front door and quietly slipped that key into the lock. The killer raised the gun, unlocked the door, and threw it open, and as they did, the door slid a small rug out of the way, and the killer stepped right inside and then slammed the door behind them. And Jimmy was standing right there in the room. and when Jimmy turned around and saw a person in his house with a gun, he just started running, trying to get away. But the killer was ready, and they began shooting at Jimmy. Jimmy screamed out and fell to the floor right in front of the fireplace, and blood began pouring out of his shoulder and back, and the killer didn't even move. They stood right there firing over and over again, aiming at Jimmy's neck and head until the gun was empty. And after it was empty, the killer just stood there for a minute, staring at Jimmy's now lifeless body. Then they turned, calmly walked out of the front door, closed it, and locked it using that key. Then the killer crouched down, ran back across the lawn to their car, hopped inside, and sped all the way across town to their house. And once they were inside, they went right to their bedroom, hoping their mother had no idea they had even left. It would turn out the drug dealer Pooh provided Jimmy's killer with the murder weapon, but Pooh himself did not kill Jimmy. Jimmy's killer was his own 19-year-old stepson, Dwayne Moore, Carla's son. It would turn out Dwayne and Jimmy's relationship was far more volatile than Dwayne let on to police. Jimmy's adherence to his kind of obsessive routines and his belief that things should be done a very particular way had made it difficult for him to get along with the stepson, who he thought was kind of aimless and had no structure in his life. And so in an effort to combat this, Jimmy became a very strict stepfather to Dwayne, imposing all kinds of rules on the young man. And eventually, Jimmy kicked Dwayne out of the house when he caught Dwayne smoking weed. Dwayne had been on the investigators' radar from the beginning. As Jimmy's stepson, Dwayne made a logical suspect. But it was not until the woman in pajamas rushed into that police station with a wild story to tell that things began to fall into place. It turned out the woman in pajamas' husband was Dwayne's favorite uncle, and Dwayne had apparently spilled a whole bunch of information about Jimmy's murder to him, including Pooh's involvement. And so when Pooh was brought into custody, he admitted that he had gotten Dwayne a gun, but he said it was not the gun he'd photographed with the stacks of cash, and he said he had not killed Jimmy. Then Pooh told police that Dwayne often used his mother's cell phone, and so all those text messages they found to and from Pooh were actually with Dwayne, not Carla. Carla really had no idea what was going on. After Pooh spoke to investigators, they searched Dwayne and Carla's house, and they discovered that Dwayne had several pairs of basketball shoes that were size 10.5. He was definitely the one who had left that footprint at Jimmy's house. And soon after that, Dwayne would confess to the murder. But he said he didn't kill Jimmy just out of spite for how strict Jimmy had been. Instead, he said he had committed the murder because he believed Jimmy was mistreating his mother and trying to rip her off by not selling the house. Dwayne was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 22 years in prison without parole. He will be 43 years old when he is finally released. The University of Central Arkansas, Jimmy's alma mater, went on to create the Jimmy McLean Scholarship Fund to celebrate Jimmy's life in sports and to honor his dedication to mentoring student athletes. Mount Fuji is the highest mountain in Japan, rising up to 3,776 meters, and it's actually a volcano. It's dormant. The last time it erupted was in 1707, but geologists still classify it as active. Tourists are allowed to climb Mount Fuji, but only between July and September, because in the winter months, the mountain gets completely treacherous. There's snow and ice, and the wind picks up. It's very, very dangerous, so it's off limits. Now, thrill seekers, if they really wanted to, they could climb Mount Fuji in the winter, because there isn't a security guard posted up at the bottom of Mount Fuji checking people in and out. It's on you. If you want to climb it when it's off limits, well, then you're climbing at your own risk, because basically it's a terrible idea. But if you have the right equipment and you have all the right training, it is doable. One thrill seeker, a 47-year-old named Tetsu, decided he wanted to hike Mount Fuji in the winter of 2019. He wanted to live stream his entire journey to the summit. Now, Tetsu might have been a thrill seeker, but he certainly wasn't a mountain climber. He did not have the experience, nor did he have any of the equipment necessary for a climb up Mount Fuji in the winter. Wearing only street clothes and carrying nothing more than climbing poles and his smartphone, he turned on his live stream and he began hiking up the Shubashiri Trail. Viewers began tuning in as Tetsu happily made his way up this ash-covered trail, and then the ash turned into light snow, and then light snow turned into really heavy snow and ice and wind. And then Tetsu began complaining about how cold he was and how he couldn't feel his hands, and his viewers are egging him on to, keep going, keep pushing through it. And probably because of the pressure he felt from his viewers, he kept going when really this would have been the moment to turn around. When you're realizing that you don't have the right equipment and it's getting really cold and you're probably not even halfway up, that's the time to turn around. But he didn't. He pressed on. As he moved up the mountain, the path he was on continued to narrow and become increasingly more covered in ice, and the guard fence that straddled the side of this path was getting to the place where it comes to a stop, signaling the most dangerous section of the hike, which is the last leg up to the summit. He gets to that point where the fence comes to an end, and now he's on this narrow stretch where the wind is just whipping across and it's all ice, and he's trying to walk across the ice with this totally inappropriate footwear. He should have had on at least crampons, the metal spikes that go on the bottom of your shoe to grip ice. He just had tennis shoes on, and so he's slipping and sliding as he's walking up this icy trail, and then he finally staggers and falls, but he catches himself. And you can hear him laughing on the live stream, joking with his audience how dangerous and slippery it is. And his viewers begin to change their tone a little bit. And they're like, hey, you might want to consider turning around now. But Tetsu is totally focused on getting to the top. So he stands back up and he continues to kind of shuffle his way towards the summit on this stretch of ice. He finally gets right up below the summit to where on his live stream you can actually see the top of Mount Fuji. And you can tell that his footwear at this point is basically not able to handle how slick it is. He's basically constantly stumbling. And you can see he notices a little stretch of small rocks that seem to almost make stepping stones up to the summit. And he begins walking over very carefully on the ice to try to use these rocks to get himself up to the top. And right as he's trying to step for one of these rocks, he loses his balance. And on camera, he says, wait, I'm slipping. And then he falls and begins rocketing down the side of this mountain. Now, when you fall on a steep mountain, you have one, maybe two chances to self-arrest. So, for example, if you had an ice pick and you were like Tetsu and you start falling, you would want to roll over and dig the head of that ice pick into the ground and basically anchor your knees and elbows and drive everything you can into the snow to stop yourself from falling. And so if you can't do that in one or two attempts, your momentum will pick up and you'll be going too fast and you won't be able to stop yourself. And then you just gotta hope you survive the fall. Tetsu did not have an ice pick or any other tool to help him self-arrest, and he didn't have the training for what to do in a situation like this, so he didn't even attempt to roll over and dig his elbows or knees into the ground to try to slow down. So he just goes flying down the mountain, he's on his back, he's not slowing down, and he knows he's doomed. And he says on camera, well, it can't be helped, before he flies over the edge and falls hundreds of meters down to his death. His viewers who watched this happen alerted authorities, who found his body the next day over 1,000 meters away from where he had first fallen. Every year, there is a handful of people that attempt to climb Mount Fuji in the winter, and they meet the same fate.
Our next story is called Into the Wild.
On September 6, 1992, two moose hunters that were hunting just outside of Denali National Park in Alaska were walking up to a well-known landmark amongst hunters in the area. It was this old school bus that was parked in the middle of nowhere. It was all rusted over and nature had practically overgrown it. And hunters, trappers, and travelers would use this bus as kind of like a center point that you would reference where you were going relative to this particular bus. But when they walked up to it, they saw on the outside of the door that there was a note. Attention possible visitors, SOS, I need your help. I am injured, near death, and too weak to hike out of here. I am all alone. This is not a joke. In the name of God, please remain to save me. I am out collecting berries close by and shall return this evening. Thank you, Chris McCandless. Dated August ? 5 months earlier, in April of 1992, Chris McCandless, the one who wrote that note, had hitchhiked from Carthage, South Dakota to Fairbanks, Alaska. Once there, he hitchhiked again with an electrician named Jim Gallion who was making his way out of Fairbanks. Chris introduced himself as Alex and asked Jim if he would take him to Denali National Park, which was about 2 hours away to the southwest. On the drive, Jim asked Chris what he was going to be doing at the park, because this is like wild Alaska country, and frankly, Chris did not look like a rugged Alaskan outdoorsman. Chris told Jim that he was going to be living off the land for a few months. Jim would later say that he had serious doubts about Chris's ability to survive in the Alaskan bush. As it was, Chris only had a light backpack, did have a rifle, but he really didn't have warm clothes on. He only had 10 pounds of rice. That was the only thing he brought for food. He didn't have a compass. He didn't have a map. He didn't have a watch. He just seemed totally ill-equipped for what he was saying he was going to go do. At some point, Jim tried to convince Chris not to go, or to at least postpone, and he even offered, hey, I'll drive you up to Anchorage and I'll buy you equipment. You need the right equipment for what you're going to be doing. Let's go there first. But Chris was stubborn, and so Jim ultimately relented and said, okay. He drove him to the park. Before Chris left, Jim actually gave him a pair of warm boots that he had in his truck. He said, here, you can use these more than I can. And Chris thanked him, took his boots, and he was on his way. Although Chris was planning for this extensive hike through Denali National Park all the way to the Bering Sea, Chris would only make it about 20 miles into his journey before stopping at an old rusted bus just outside of the park. Chris would live in this bus for 16 weeks, and according to his diary, that first week he was there was particularly rough. He was snowed in, he couldn't catch anything to eat, so he's hungry and cold, but shortly thereafter, he developed a routine. He was able to hunt successfully for some small game. He found some plants that were good to eat, and by and large, his entries made it seem like he was very happy. However, the last month of diary entries really painted a very different picture. After living in this bus for nearly 3 months, he indicated in his diary that he was kind of sick and tired of living off the land and he was ready to return back to society. So on July 3rd, he packs up his camp and he starts walking back the 20 miles towards where he came into the park in the first place. But when he came into the park 3 months earlier, the river that he was going to need to cross was frozen. And now that he's returning in the summer, it had thawed, and now it's the 75-foot wide raging river that was basically impossible to cross. And so he's trapped on the wrong side of this river. What he didn't know, because he didn't have a compass, he didn't have a map, he didn't know the area well, was there was actually a hand-operated tram that would take you across the river in the summer. It was only a mile away from his camp that was labeled on almost every map. In addition, there was a hunting cabin not far from that tram that's also on just about every map of this particular area. It had food, it had clothes, it had bedding. He could have stayed in this hunting cabin until conditions were okay again to make the journey back home. But again, he doesn't have a map, so he doesn't know these things exist. So at some point, he turns around and goes back to the bus, feeling totally dejected. That night, his journal entry just said, "Reined in, river looks impossible, lonely, scared." All of Chris's diary entries following his return to the bus after not being able to cross this river got shorter and bleaker and really painted a picture of a guy that was going downhill. The final entry in Chris's diary just says, "Beautiful blue berries." And then 19 days after his final entry is when those two moose hunters find this bus and see the note, the SOS note, pinned to the outside. The hunters go inside the bus, and there, laying in a sleeping bag, is the body of Christopher McCandless. Although it's not entirely clear how Christopher actually died, the two most common theories are either starvation or perhaps he ingested a poisonous plant seed. The hunters alerted authorities who came out and they launched an investigation, and during this investigation they found Chris's camera. Chris was an avid photographer. He had taken loads of pictures over the course of his stay out in the wild, and so he took one last dignified picture of himself before curling up in his sleeping bag and passing away.
Our next story is called One-Way Trip.
Bryce Gillies was born in 1989 in Northern Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C. From a young age, Bryce's parents knew he loved the outdoors, and so they signed him up for the Boy Scouts. And as a scout, Bryce learned, amongst many things, how to survive in the wilderness. And he would routinely put this training to the test by leaving his house and heading off to the nearby Appalachian Trail and hiking around sometimes up to 20 miles in a single day. Bryce ultimately became an Eagle Scout, which is the highest rank anybody can obtain inside of the Boy Scouts, a rank that only about 8% of Scouts will ever reach. After he graduated from high school in 2007, Bryce decided he wanted to go to school out west. And during a visit to Northern Arizona University, Bryce fell in love with their school because all around their campus were these unbelievable hiking trails that were totally unlike anything he saw growing up on the East Coast. Bryce decided this was his dream school, so he applied, and a couple weeks later, he got accepted. He was totally thrilled. During his first couple of years at NAU, Bryce took full advantage of these totally amazing hiking trails within a couple hours of the campus. He also spent some time overseas in West Africa, helping to build a medical clinic for people in need. During the summer break of 2009, so going into his third year at NAU, Bryce was still living out in Arizona in an apartment, and he still had a few weeks before classes started. And so he decided he would head off to the nearby Grand Canyon to do a little bit of hiking. He had recently read in an outdoor magazine about this lesser known but unbelievable trail that was just for experts in the canyon that he wanted to try. It was called the Deer Creek Thunder River Loop, and it brought hikers to this remote location where water gushed out of this huge limestone rock wall, transforming the desert landscape below into this unbelievable green oasis. The article said very strong hikers could complete this nearly 28-mile loop in about 3 days. Since Bryce considered himself a very strong hiker, he decided this was perfect for him. Bryce called his parents and let them know he was going to do this loop, and that when he came back in a couple of days, he'd be making a trip to Virginia to visit with them. Then Bryce called some friends in the area to see if they wanted to come with him on this hike, but no one was available, so Bryce decided he would go on his own. So the next day, which was Saturday, July 18th, Bryce loaded up his car and he began driving these several hours to the parking lot that was nearest the trailhead. Bryce parked his car, he got his gear out of the trunk, and then he set off down the trail. Bryce had not obtained a backcountry permit for this hike. This was a requirement for anybody doing an overnight out in the canyon, which Bryce planned on doing. Bryce also didn't file his route with the park rangers. Had he told them where he was going, they would have tried to talk him out of it. The Deer Creek Thunder River Loop had no protection from the sun the entire time, and since it was July, he would be hit with the highest temperatures and the most direct sunlight. All this on top of the fact that even in the coolest times of the year, this trail is still an extremely difficult trail because of the terrain you have to navigate. In fact, when hikers did file their route with park rangers and they indicated they were going to be doing this expert loop, they would ask them to provide next of kin information in case they died during their hike. It's unclear if Bryce was just very confident in himself and his abilities, or if he was being reckless. From his car, Bryce hiked about 2 miles down some switchbacks into the canyon. Once he reached the bottom, he would have found himself in this wide open flat area called the Esplanade that kind of looked like the surface of the moon with all these potholes all over it. At this point in Bryce's hike, it would have been dark out, so he would have set up his tent somewhere on the rocks and camped out for the night. People that have done this, that have camped out on the Esplanade, have said it's unbelievably beautiful because most people experience the Grand Canyon from high up on one of the rims looking down into it. But the Esplanade is literally inside the canyon, so you have this unobstructed view in both directions, and apparently it's quite beautiful. The next morning, Bryce got up at sunrise, he packed up his campsite, and then he continued on his hike. The first challenge he would come up against that morning was navigating down what's called the Red Wall, which is a fairly steep and treacherous descent that for an experienced hiker, it would take about an hour to safely navigate. And then at the bottom of the Red Wall, you would enter into this area called the Surprise Valley. No one really knows why it's named that, but hikers who have been down in this valley, they think it's named after the surprise you feel when you get in there and you realize how much hotter it is. Typically, it's about 10 or 20 degrees hotter down inside of this bowl. After Bryce successfully navigated down the Red Wall, he entered into this totally miserable Surprise Valley, but he would have known he was only about a half-mile away from his target destination, the Deer Creek Thunder River, where he planned to jump in and cool off. So, eager to do that, Bryce took off, but made a critical mistake. He went the wrong way. While it's unclear exactly how this happened, experts believe his ears played a trick on him. Hikers are told as they're approaching this river in the middle of the desert, they should listen out for it, because when you get fairly close, you can hear the sound of rushing water. But hikers have to be careful because sometimes when the wind is blowing in a certain direction, that sound from the river will echo off the inside of this bowl and it will appear to come from the opposite direction. It's believed Bryce was following his map when he heard the sound of this river coming from a different direction, and so he abandoned the map and followed the sound. Bryce walked for quite a while in the wrong direction all the way up a hill, and most likely the whole time he was hearing the sound of the water, and he probably thought, once I get over the top of this hill, I'll look down the other side and I will see the water. But when he crested the hill, he looked down and just saw a barren valley. Had he continued another quarter mile down into the valley and then up the other side, he could have turned around and he would have been able to spot an obvious landmark that would have brought him to the river. But most likely, Bryce was exhausted from the extreme heat and the sunlight and trekking all this way, and so he felt like it was probably too risky to keep going down into this valley because he had no idea where it went. So in keeping with his wilderness training he got as a Boy Scout, he dropped all of his heavy equipment off the side of the trail in an area he had marked so he could eventually come back and retrieve it. And then he took his water, food, and headlamp, turned around, and began backtracking. After a little while, Bryce decided to abandon the trail and actually veer off onto a dry creek bed. In the Boy Scouts, they're taught any dry creek bed will eventually connect to water. And so at this point, Bryce is probably running low on water and figures whether this leads him to the Deer Creek Thunder River or some other water body, he didn't care. He just needed water. So off he went on this dry creek bed, but after a while, he saw less and less vegetation. It was just this barren desert in all directions. After a little while longer, Bryce dropped all of his gear on the ground after finishing his water. At this point, he would have known that if he doesn't find a water source soon, he won't make it. And so Bryce just continues to trudge along on this dry riverbed, not seeing any indication that he's getting any closer to water. But then he looks up and he sees the land in front of him appears to slope downward out of view. And then beyond that, he sees off in the distance what looks like the southern wall of the Grand Canyon. And below the southern wall is the Colorado River. And so Bryce would have known if he can just go down this decline, he's certain to reach this river and he'll be saved. And so Bryce made his way up to where the ground started going down towards the river, and he began safely descending fairly slowly, and then he reached a very steep section called a spill, which is a dry waterfall, and these vary in height, but they're pretty steep and they're pretty slick. Once Bryce went down one of these things, there'd be no way to get back up again. So this was a one-way trip. But Bryce was desperate. He knew his only chance was getting down to that Colorado River, which he could now see. And so Bryce scrambled down this first spill, and then he found another one, and he kept going down these spills, and they kept getting steeper and more challenging, and the temperature continued to rise as he went down deeper into this canyon. Finally, Bryce reached a spill that was very, very steep, and it was nearly vertical. But again, Bryce couldn't go back up the way he came. He had to keep going. So at some point, he threw himself off of the spill, and he fell down 30 feet, but he lived. He stood up, he dusted himself off, and he continued walking forward. He walked past these boulders into this clearing, and right in front of him is the Colorado River. It's a half a mile straight down in front of him. But the only way to get to it was navigating another spill. And this spill was 80 feet tall, and it was almost completely vertical. There was no way to survive that kind of fall. And Bryce couldn't just turn around and try to find an alternate route because this was a one-way trip. He could not climb back up the spills he had just come down to get there. And to his left and to his right were these steep canyon walls that kind of bordered the space he was in that had no handholds on them, so he couldn't climb them up or down. Bryce was trapped, and he knew it. The following Tuesday, when Bryce was supposed to be home in Virginia visiting his family, he didn't show up. So his family tried calling him, but they couldn't get through to him. It seemed like his phone was off, and so they called the authorities. A search party was sent out in the Grand Canyon to go look for Bryce, and on Saturday, July 25th, so this is 6 days after Bryce has found himself trapped on that ledge overlooking the river, a search party was on the Colorado River, and they happened to look up in the direction where Bryce had been, and they noticed what looked like a person, and so they got their climbing gear and they made their way up that spill onto this ledge, and they found Bryce. He was sitting up against a boulder, and he was deceased. He had died from heat stroke and dehydration. In his hand was his BlackBerry cell phone. It wouldn't have had any service inside of the canyon, but Bryce used it as a notepad to write a final message to his family and to his friends. In it, he writes, "Life is good whether it is long or short. I was fortunate to do much more than most people, and for that I am very thankful." His message also had some humor thrown into it. He said to his family that he was really thankful he had his BlackBerry phone because it would have been a lot harder to etch his final message into a rock. He also said that he didn't know what the afterlife held for him, he just hoped they had water. Then, with his phone's battery dying, he wrote one final sentence. "I feel like going into the wild is a calling we all feel. Some answer it, and some die for it." Then, shortly after writing that message, Bryce clutched his phone to his chest, and he passed away. He was just 20 years old.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Gates of the Arctic.
Growing up in Oklahoma, Blake Stanfield loved going out in the wilderness with his father, Neil. The pair were more like best friends than father and son, and they spent as much time together as they possibly could. But by the time Blake was in his 30s, he had become a medical doctor, and so he was really busy, and he was married, and he had a young kid, and so he didn't see his father very much. And then in 2003, when Blake was 38, he moved his family to Alaska, and so he really didn't see his father anymore. But shortly after moving, Blake had an idea. He wanted to surprise his dad on his 65th birthday with a rafting trip in Alaska. It was going to be this great way for the two to reconnect with each other. When he broke the news to his father, Neil was really touched by it and very excited, but at the same time, he was a little bit apprehensive, and he asked his son, are we going in a group? Is this going to be a guided rafting trip? And Blake said, "Oh no, that's the wrong way to do this. We will not have a good time if we go with a group. We're doing this alone." And so Neil said, "Well, isn't that a little bit risky, just the two of us out in the middle of Alaska?" And Blake said, "Don't worry, I've picked a river that by Alaskan standards is considered leisurely, so we'll be just fine." Neil was still hesitant about it, but the two of them were very confident outdoorsmen, and so ultimately he just went along with it. So later that year, in early July, Blake and Neil took a float plane out to the Gates of the Arctic National Park in Alaska. This park is totally beautiful, but it's also very dangerous because it's full of grizzly bears and wolves, and it's also very remote. There's no people anywhere near this park. It's basically untouched wilderness. Adding to the isolation and danger, Blake and Neil did not have their cell phones or a radio. It was Blake's idea. He said it would be a good idea for us to just totally disconnect and just spend quality time together. And then also, Blake had chosen a starting point on this river that was situated basically right in the middle of the park, which meant it was 60 miles away from the nearest human settlement. So after they got dropped off by this float plane, and then the captain of that plane took off again, Blake and Neil loaded their stuff into their raft, and then they hopped in, and they started cruising down this river. At first, their trip was awesome. The weather was perfect, the landscape was beautiful, the water was totally calm, and Neil, he might have had reservations about the safety of this trip, but quickly he was overcome with just how peaceful it was, and how wonderful it was to be with just his son out on the open water. And in fact, Blake had intentionally booked this trip 2 weeks before the start of the official rafting season in Alaska, which meant really there was nobody else in the water. It was just those two. And they thought, wow, what luck. Except it turns out there's a very specific reason why the rafting season starts when it does in Alaska. Because that's the earliest the ice melts in the river and it becomes safe to travel on. After 2 hours of peace and tranquility out on this river, Blake and Neil started to notice these large ice chunks in the water ahead of them. And they were easy enough to get around, but as they kept moving, the current was picking up and these ice chunks got bigger and bigger until they started being these huge sheets all across the edges of the river where there was only a narrow strip of water they could travel through. And at some point, Neil asked Blake if it would be a good idea to just pull the raft over to the side of the river and get out and reassess the situation and see if we've reached an anomaly in the river where just this section is frozen, or if this is going to continue for a lot farther, and if so, we need to make alternative plans here. But Blake was not having it. He was stubborn, he wanted to keep going, and he was convinced he could maneuver the boat around the ice. And he said, let's just keep going a little bit farther. And so when they went a little bit farther, they reached a point where the current was so strong that they could no longer get out of the river. They had to ride it like a rapid until it stopped. And so as the father and son are fighting with each other about not having gotten out of the river while they still had a chance, they were not paying attention to what was in front of them, and they came around a corner and there was this huge ice shelf that was right across the whole river that basically blocked the whole path. And they turned at the last second. They couldn't do anything either way, but the nose of the raft went directly under the ice shelf and it flipped the raft onto its side, dumping Neil and Blake into frigid Alaskan waters underneath the ice shelf. And Blake would later say that he really believed that this was it. He didn't know how far this ice shelf was going to go on for, and so he assumed, I'm about to drown. But they managed to hit this air pocket inside of this ice shelf. The ice basically formed up at a bow, and they both happened to pop up into it, and they gripped onto the ice. And they're looking at each other, and they have no idea how long this ice shelf continues. But the current is pulling them, and they know it's just a matter of time before they get sucked under and go back under the ice. And so they look at each other, and they don't really know what to say, but it's kind of obvious that they think they're about to drown. And then at some point, Neil gets sucked under and swept away, and then Blake follows shortly after. And then fortunately, they only tumbled along for about 10 or 15 more feet before they popped up again. But much like the boat that could not paddle out of the river because of how strong the current was, Blake and Neil could not get out of the river in time before they hit yet another ice shelf. And the next ice shelf was much longer than the first. And so they knew it was going to happen. They grabbed onto the ice shelf and they're holding on and they're trying to pull themselves back out, but the current's too strong. And at some point, they each had to take a big breath and then let go and got pulled directly under the ice. And so the whole time they're pressing their face up against the underside of this ice in hopes they find an air pocket, but they don't. And so the whole time they're just desperately looking for air and they're bumping into the underside of the ice. They have no idea how long it's going to go on for. And so after what felt like an eternity, Blake finally gets shot out the backside of this huge ice shelf. And he's still in the river, but there's no more ice shelves in front of him. And the current had slowed down a little bit. So he was able to make his way to the edge and get out of the water. And he turned to face the water, and his dad was nowhere to be found. And so Blake turns, and he doesn't see his father coming out of the ice. He doesn't know if he's still under, if he came out again. And so he turns and runs downstream in hopes that he might have come out already. And sure enough, he found his dad clutching a rock in the middle of this river farther up. His head was badly bleeding, but he was alive. And so Blake grabbed a stick and was able to bring his father back into shore. Even though they had survived being pulled under the ice, they now had no equipment, no gear, no food, no water, no anything because it was pulled under the water. And they were soaking wet and becoming hypothermic. And they're in the middle of nowhere with no one nearby to help them. And no one's expecting them for a week. And no planes are going to be in the area for 2 weeks. Fortunately, Blake had a lighter in his pocket that worked, and so they were able to start a fire and stay warm, and they were able to scare away grizzly bears and wolves. Blake finally walked away from their campsite, which was up on a mountain, and he went down to this river where he was able to flag down a float plane that was not even scheduled to be in the area. It was just totally random, and they saw Blake, they came back, they picked him up, and both men were just fine. They did say that even though the trip was a complete disaster and nearly killed both of them, it did reconnect them in a way that few things could, and their relationship is good as ever. But they both say they will never go rafting again.
Und ohne Glanz, oh, irgendwann erinnerst du dich dann. Und du hörst noch diese Lieder und du hörst die Musik von damals. Die Liebeslieder und die Seemannslieder mit all dem Stolz der Seemännerschichten. Irgendjemand gibt es Frieden, aber dafür braucht es keine Kriegen. Oh, das waren ein paar peinliche Witzchen, aber die Wälder blühen so wie damals. Die Verwandlung schreitet wieder, auf geht das Karussell. In dir hören die Lieder, keine Angst zu haben, ist keine Chance.
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen's podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts, not just this one, but also MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, and Runful. Just search for Ballin Studios on any podcast platform, and you'll find all of them. If you want to watch hundreds